Now, let's jump into the leadoff as we start every show, and let's talk about the MLB Wild Card Chase. We're going to break it down by league, American League and National League, and the American League Wild Card Race is where we're going to start because it is tight. Very, very tight. And when you talk about 6 teams, 7, 8 teams that are really in the mix and only a few games, out. Toronto, Tampa Bay, and Seattle all have a 2.5. They're all tied for the wild card spot. Remember, there's 3 wild card spots because of the expanded playoffs. So Tampa Bay, Toronto, and Seattle all have a 2.5 lead game over Minnesota and Baltimore. So if the season were to end today, Tampa Bay, Toronto, and Seattle would be in the playoffs as wild card teams. Now, Minnesota, as we talked about on the last episode, is also jockeying for the division championship in the AL Central. Baltimore has a bit of a tough go, but the potential of making the playoffs and really, getting that rebuild that started after the Tigers on the right foot as far as success goes. So there's really, like I said, Tampa Bay, Toronto, Seattle, Minnesota, Baltimore, and then beyond 2.5 games, the Chicago White Sox are 3.5 games back, which we talked about them last week in the division, potentially being someone that could make some noise. And then Boston is also 6 back. So that's kind of where I put the cutoff with this amount of time and this many teams to jump. The Red Sox are really probably the last team you would look at as potentially getting into a wild card spot, being 6 games back with about 6 weeks to play. Now, Texas, they're the next team at 10.5 games back. They could potentially make, it would take a miracle. Let's be very clear, it would take a miracle. But just with so many teams, you're talking 1, 2, 3, 4 teams that they would have to jump just to get into that last spot. It just seems highly improbable. So I only wanted to talk about the teams that seemed like they had a good odds-on chance, with the Red Sox being kind of maybes. Okay, so let's look at some notes here. Right, Tampa Bay and Toronto, they're going to play each other 9 times over the course of the rest of the season, which means to me that only one of these 2 teams is getting in. It's only going to be one of these 2 teams. Seattle has the easiest path. They have 25 games to end the season against teams that are double digits below 500. So I would almost count Seattle to be in, especially with that pitching staff, making that trade for Luis Castillo. You've got Julio Rodriguez, who is just a phenomenal rookie. I would definitely consider Seattle a lock for the playoffs and ending that long playoff drought. Now, will they make noise in the playoffs? Who knows? I mean, that pitching staff, anything can happen. But I definitely think Seattle is in. Baltimore has it pretty rough being in the AL East, and the majority of their games left are against those division rivals. They do have a few gimmies tossed in with Detroit and things like that, but they are going to have a tough road. We discussed the White Sox schedule at length. They're too inconsistent and have so many games against the Guardians and the Twins left that it's going to be really difficult for them to get into a wild card position, especially with all the teams above them. And the winner of the AL Central obviously is going to be in. I would look for that second place team to most likely be the third wild card spot, taking the spot of either Tampa Bay or Toronto. So before we get to predictions, let's get to the National League. Right now, currently, Atlanta is in that first spot with an 8-game lead. San Diego is in that second spot with only a half-game lead. And then Philadelphia is in the third spot with a 1.5 lead over Milwaukee. So Atlanta has 8 games on San Diego. San Diego only has half a game on Philadelphia. And Philadelphia has a 1.5 over Milwaukee. They have a 6-game lead, Philadelphia does, over San Francisco, and an 11-game lead over Arizona. So Atlanta is a lock. They're either going to get in through the division, as we talked about on the last episode. They're 4 games currently behind the New York Mets, or they're going to be in on a wild card. San Diego's been struggling since the trade deadline. Shocker. Josh Hader is getting a break from closing, according to Bob Melvin, and they have a 4-game lead over Milwaukee, who is that 4th challenger, would be the first one out if we were talking about NCAA basketball. Philadelphia has a decently simple schedule the remainder of the way, but they do end the season with the Houston Astros, which could be very problematic for them. Could be an issue for them, ending with a tough team if they need to squeak out 2 games to get in or to hold on to a spot. That 3-game series could prove very pivotal. And what this all means is these next few weeks are going to be very, very exciting. We talked about the divisions on the last episode. We're talking about the wild card here. The reality is there's going to be games that you want to tune into because they have postseason significance. So, what are AJ's predictions of what the MLB playoffs will look like? Well, here's what I think, or how I see things going. I think New York, the Yankees, are going to right the ship, and I think that they're going to walk away with that division. They now have an 8-game lead after avoiding the sweep with the Toronto Blue Jays this weekend. I think they're in. I think they win the division and are in. I think the Cleveland Guardians are going to be the team out of the Central that wins. One of the youngest teams in Major League Baseball, but they are a very difficult out, and they've got a pretty significant pitching staff with Shane Bieber and Tristan McKenzie, who's come on. It's just they're going to be tough down the stretch. And then obviously I think Houston in the West. I mean, the Yankees and Houston are not really predictions, right? They're like guarantees. Same thing with the Dodgers, right? When I talk about the NL. In the NL, the Dodgers are going to win the West. There's no doubt about that. Those are like locks. I think St. Louis is also going to win their division. And I think the Mets will also win the division. I think the Mets and the Braves are going to jockey back and forth. But I think ultimately, with the pitching staff that the New York Mets has, with Max Scherzer and Jacob deGrom, it's lights out. Especially when you hear that Narcos song and Edwin Diaz is coming trotting in from the bullpen. If you are losing to the Mets after the 8th inning, you might as well just go home. Just close down the door. Because when those trumpets start blaring, the game is over. So let's talk about the wild card. Okay? Here's where I think the wild card plays in. And here's how I think it shapes out. I think with the 9 meetings between Toronto and Tampa Bay, I think Toronto gets the better of Tampa Bay and ultimately pushes Tampa Bay out of the playoffs. I think Toronto is overall the better team, especially when it comes to offensive prowess. I think that they have one of the better closers in the game, and I think that their pitching staff actually can stand up a little bit better than Tampa Bay's can. Seattle, as I said earlier, is in. I think that they end the playoff drought. They are in. And then I think taking Tampa Bay's spot is I think the Twins squeak in maybe on the last game of the season, maybe with like a few games left, but I think that the Twins squeak into that last wild card spot. In the National League, I think Atlanta not winning the NL East is going to obviously have that first wild card locked up. I think Philadelphia is going to squeak in, and I think that Milwaukee is going to squeak in, which means that San Diego is going to miss the playoffs after having the craziest deadline of any team. Since that deadline, here's my reasoning. Since that deadline, San Diego is only 9-9. They're 500 baseball club. And you have to wonder if all of those moves affected team chemistry. Not to mention the move that they thought was going to be a lock of Fernando Tatis Jr. coming back, not being in their clubhouse because of his recent suspension. So is there a little bit of apathy, some disgruntledness? I don't know. I'm not out there and I'm not involved and I don't want to speculate, but I think that, the proof is in the pudding when we look at 9-9 over the 18 games since the trade deadline. it's not going to go well. The schedule for them is not that favorable. They have 2 with Cleveland and 9 more with the Los Angeles Dodgers, 3 with St. Louis, and 2 with Seattle. All of these games, 16 games out of 38 against contenders. Not to mention, they also have 6 games against San Francisco and 3 games with the Chicago White Sox, which is 25 games with teams that are either leading their division, Cleveland, Los Angeles, St. Louis, or above 500. So there's not a lot of room for error when it comes to the San Diego Padres. So that's my prediction. I think you have an AL playoff picture that looks like the Yankees, the Guardians, the Astros, the Blue Jays, the Mariners, and the Twins. And I think you have an NL picture that looks like the Mets, the Cardinals, the Dodgers, the Braves, the Phillies, and the Brewers. So we'll check back in a few weeks, and we'll see how many of my predictions were actually correct. Newsflash, it's going to be all of them. That is going to do it for the leadoff.
Man on a mission, I'ma get it. You know I be on a what? Yeah.